We have now gone a month past the release of Season 3. So this will be our last season of the expansion. We have now left with the mid-season patches like the 0.5 and the 0.7 patches that we have gotten every time now for a few seasons. However, we have a unique thing this expansion. We are returning back to what we have had before, but quite a few years ago, because in Dragonflight we have gotten the Season 4 with the Fated season, so no new raids, no new zones, just the combined recycled raids of the entire expansion, made much easier though, as well as a new pool of Mythic Plus dungeons, usually going back from older dungeons being brought up into Mythic Plus version. In Shadowlands is where this all began, the first of the Fated seasons in Season 4 of Shadowlands. And before that, we had the traditional 4-season expansions, because BFA was Uldir, into Nighthold, into Eternal Palace, into Nyalota. And before that you had Legion. Legion was Emerald Nightmare plus Trial of Valor, Season 1, into Nighthold, into Tomb of Sargeras, into Argus. So back then you didn't even have sort of the filler of the Fated season, you had proper raid releases for 4 different patches. So I know time flies, but basically it's been 10 years since we've gone down to not having either a 4th season or a 4th season with, the Fated meme sort of season at the very end. This was after the announcement and the promise of Blizzard to shorten the expansion cycles. Blizzard did say, as they were getting into this new trilogy of the Worldsoul Saga, that one of the also plans was to shorten up on the expansion duration. And I remember this, maybe even you remember this, because this was talk for possible, as usual, complaints about the idea of wanting to shorten the expansions but keeping the price the same, right? So hold on a second, up to now I have been paying some whatever $70 for the heroic version of the game, however much it was, and the game lasted for like 24 months. Now you're cutting down the game to 18 months only, but the price is staying the same. Something like that was one of the complaints back then. However, the other complaint was, yeah, right, Blizzard is never going to adhere, to stick to this word. They will totally slow down their patch cycles, they will slow down on their promise, and we will eventually just lag behind this and end up having once more a 2+ year long expansion cycle. Now, we have already had somewhat of a taste of this in Dragonflight, where the patch cadence started getting faster and we started getting this I guess this trend of 0.5 and 0.7 patches. It wasn't nearly as continuous, it wasn't nearly as precise, but we definitely did start to establish the trend. Remember the 0.5 and the 0.7 patches at the release of Dragonflight, where we had the Siren Isle, mini zone, and then they added more content in the following seasons. Like in Season 2, we had the dragon riding becoming worldwide for all of the zones in the game. That was the introduction of the follower dungeons. In the 0.7 patch, towards the end of the expansion, is where we got the time running pandemonium, the Harbinger quests. Had a few more additions of content, but the expansion was still longer. However, with The War Within, we have now gotten actually to see Blizzard stick to their promise, and we look like we're gonna get pretty much our first 18 months long expansion. So the expansion came out with the very much not controversial early release. Right, the pre-order getting you 3 days early release of the game on the 26th of August. Well, pretty simple, we are almost a year later now. We have gotten the release of the expansion on the 26th of August, and then these were the dates of the patches being released. I'm sure you can count for yourself as well, 60 days is 2 months. So these releases are pretty much sticking to a 2-month cycle. We have 57, 56, 57 and 56 as the gaps between patches, and then we have the outlier towards the high end, which was 68 days between 11.1 and 11.1.5, and the outlier towards the bottom, which was between 11.1.7 and 11.2, 49 days. When you average this out, it's just below a 2-month cycle for the patches. Now, we also already know pretty much after knowing all of this that this means that 11.2.5, the content that will bring us not just the turbo boost event for empowering our characters, removing the gilded or all of the crests cap, the weekly cap will be removed, and of course the dinar vendor for you to buy your best in slot items. It will also come with Legion Remix, and this should come very early October. And then, based on the numbers we already know, 11.2.7 should come in December. This also means that based on the timings we already know, which was the release being at the end of August of last year, the next season, Season 2, coming out 6 months, almost exactly 6 months after Season 1, and then Season 3, also coming out almost exactly 6 months after Season 2, this will lead us to have the expansion release of the next expansion of Midnight 6 months after Season 3, which would mean February of next year is when we would have the Midnight expansion release. This is quite interesting and curious, of course, because none of us has ever been in this situation. No matter if you are a veteran or simply a boomer who started playing all the way back in vanilla, or even started somewhere later anywhere, whether it was Mists or Warlords or Legion, you never were really in a situation to witness an expansion lasting significantly less than 2 years. There are some that got close to that, like Warlords or Cataclysm, lasting something like 22-ish months, but those were also universally reviled for being very short, and unlike this expansion, very short but with also very little content on top of it. We're talking about the legendary 14-month-long season of Hellfire Citadel for Warlords. So this would make it easily the shortest expansion we have ever had. This creates some pretty funny and awkward situations where, for example, if the expansion were to come out in February, this means that the beta which you will also have access to if you pre-order the game, will be available 2 to 3 months before the release of the expansion, which means as we will be in Legion Remix and in the Turbo Boost event of 11.2.5 and right before 11.2.7 coming out in December, 3 months before the release of the next expansion, you would also be getting the beta. You will also be getting access to the next expansion. So while previously the beta access was coming in 3 months into a fated season, so long after you had anything interesting to do in the expansion in a season that wasn't that interesting and there wasn't that much left to do, now instead you will be getting the beta of the next expansion essentially in the middle of Season 3, which would be quite the feeling compared to what we have been used to in previous expansions. A much faster and a much accelerated patch cycle compared to before. Obviously, there is room for surprise. How many players were convinced of the statements of Blizzard before this expansion came out? The promise of making the patches faster, the content cycles faster, and the expansions overall to be shorter. Now, looks like many of the doubters have been proven wrong, given that everything is pointing towards the expansion, the next expansion coming out in a few months, and the beta itself also coming out shortly. This is where, of course, we leave room for opinions, because usually, for some players at least, the moment between the last season, the last big patch of an expansion, and the next expansion was the moment of calm, was the moment of chill, was the moment of I'm gonna play different games, I'm gonna go in my backlog, I'm gonna go and try out the games I didn't have nearly as much time to play when I was busy playing in the actual seasons, for example, and try them out. I have maybe even more time to look at things I wasn't as busy looking at into the game during Season 1 and Season 2 and Season 3, like, raiding or doing Mythic Plus. Now, at the end of the expansion, I can do some mount farming, transmog farming, leveling up different characters, etc., because the window, the gap between Season 1 and Season 2 and Season 2 and Season 3 is much shorter than the gap between Season 3 and the next expansion, or for the previous expansions, the gap between the fated season and the next expansion. Instead, now everything is much tighter and shrunk to the point that we are in this awkward situation for many, the first time we are in this situation, where the gap of Season 1 and Season 2, so you finishing the raid in Nerobar Palace, farming the raid, getting alts ready for the next season, starting to look at things like DPS, Sims, thinking about the meta for the next season and wondering what to play in Season 2, that gap will be the same gap between Season 3 and the next expansion, because it will be 6 months. So just like in Season 1, in Season 3, as you are raiding and, farming the raid, doing some Mythic Plus, the time where you will have to start asking yourself which characters to play, who is looking good, where are the Sims for next season, what are the changes, the balance tuning for next season, that gap, that feeling that you have in between every new season will also come now, even though it's not one season to the next. It's not Season 1 into Season 2 or Season 2 into Season 3, it's Season 3 into next expansion, but the gap will still be 6 months. So it is definitely a unique situation, because as we mentioned, we have never really been in a position to have an expansion last 18 months or so. So there are going to be some new experiences and opinions in the way players will feel having to, I guess you can say, prepare, get ready, get information and knowledgeable about the next expansion, since now it will be coming out much faster compared to previous expansions. As I said, I do believe for most players this would be considered a positive thing. But I guess it was also worth highlighting the fact that maybe some players will feel like they're being rushed. They would rather have wanted a slightly larger gap between the last season of the expansion and the new expansion, an extra buffer of a couple of months extra for the last season in order to cool down a bit on WoW before getting into it again for a new expansion release, which at the moment we don't seem to be having based on the release cycle of patches and how quickly we will be getting the next expansion out. That being said though, regardless of your opinion, still a applause to Blizzard for having been able to stick to their word and actually stick to a faster patch cycle, a faster release of the patches, and shrinking the length of the expansion, which turned out to be true. Even if the release of the next expansion was to be delayed by 1 month or even 2 months, it would still make it the faster expansion cycle that we have had so far in the game anyways. So we are definitely still on that track for the next expansion, on the record for the next expansion for being the fastest one. So with this pointed out and out of the way on this Saturday, this was the consideration to be had as we keep getting deeper into Season 3, which as a result means we are getting closer and closer to the release of, for example, the beta of the next expansion. So for today, on this Saturday, this was all that was worth talking about. We are starting now our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting Compete for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I have been baited a little bit, you were thinking that with the chill air and the more heavy clouds we were getting into a more temperate atmosphere. No, the sun is back,